You aren't stuck picking the same person because you have bad taste or because you're fundamentally broken. You keep choosing them because your unconscious mind is running a recognition program that happens to be working perfectly. The problem isn't that the program is failing you, but rather that it's been trained to recognize the wrong things. You meet someone new and feel that immediate pull, that sense of already knowing them, even though you've never met. Most people read this as chemistry or a deep connection, and you probably tell yourself you've finally found someone who understands you. You file these feelings under good signs and keep moving forward, but underneath that spark, something else is running entirely. Your nervous system carries a map that was built long before you had the language to describe it. This map is made of every relationship that shaped you, from the emotional texture of your earliest bonds to the specific way love felt conditional or unpredictable. You learn to navigate these dynamics just to stay close to the people you needed most, and that map got encoded into your brain before you could ever think to question it. Now it runs quietly in the background of every new connection you make. So when you meet someone who fits the map, it doesn't feel like a mistake, it feels like home. And this is where the real problem lives, because for a lot of people, home wasn't actually safe. Home was anxious or controlling or emotionally unavailable, and it might have been chaotic in ways that kept you permanently on guard. Your nervous system reads all of that chaos as familiar, which it then translates as comfortable. And eventually, your brain decides this must be the one. Carl Jung called this projection, but that word gets used so loosely today that it has lost its edge. Projection isn't just seeing what you want to see in another person. It's much more specific than that, because you are carrying pieces of your history and unfinished emotional business and locating them outside yourself. You are responding to the container before you even know what is inside of it, because that container matches something on your internal map. Marie-Louise von Franz was one of the sharpest writers on Jung's work, and she explained that projection places something on an outer object that needs a hook to hold it. That hook doesn't even have to be large for the pattern to take hold. Someone only needs to carry a tiny trace of a pattern you're primed to recognize, and the whole image locks in instantly. What you are responding to isn't really the human being in front of you, but rather the resemblance to your past. This is why the same person keeps appearing in different bodies throughout your life. It isn't because you're unlucky, or because emotionally unavailable people are the only ones who exist, but because you aren't responding to who they actually are. You are responding to how closely they fit the shape your nervous system already knows. And while the person changes, the shape stays the same. The pull you feel is genuine because your nervous system isn't lying to you. It is doing exactly what it was built to do by matching patterns at high speed and flagging familiarity as safety. The signal is real, but your interpretation of that signal is what's off. The question you need to ask isn't why you keep feeling this way, but rather what exactly this feeling is recognizing and where that recognition was built into you. That's where the shadow comes in. Most people hear the term shadow work and immediately picture themselves battling their worst impulses, like some hidden rage or a secret cruelty they would never actually act on. While that is a small part of the process, it is definitely not the whole story. In the way Carl Jung described it, your shadow is simply everything you have disowned about yourself. It is not just the dark stuff, but every single piece of your personality that got split off because it felt unsafe to express, or because the people you depended on for survival simply would not tolerate it. If you grew up in a house where showing anger was a one-way ticket to being ignored or punished, you learned to split that anger off from your identity. This was not a conscious choice you made at the kitchen table, but rather your nervous system learning over hundreds of tiny moments that being angry cost you the connection you needed to stay safe. If being vulnerable got you hurt, you buried your needs, and if taking up too much space drove people away, you compressed yourself until you were small and easy to be around. All of those traits went underground where they stayed alive, operating just outside of your awareness and quietly pushing on every choice you make from the inside. This is exactly where your shadow connects to the people you keep choosing to date. You do not just project a perfect, idealized image onto a new partner, because you are also projecting your shadow onto them. You find yourself drawn to people who seem to carry the very things you have disowned in yourself. Like someone who is loudly emotional when you have spent your whole life being contained. You might chase someone who takes up space freely while you have spent years making yourself smaller. Or perhaps you find yourself attracted to someone who is unpredictable and openly needy in ways you were never allowed to be. That magnetic pull feels like simple attraction, and on the surface it is. But there is something much more specific happening under the hood. It feels like this new person has something you are missing. And the truth is that your intuition is actually right about that. What they seem to carry is the part of you that got buried so early and so deep that you eventually stopped noticing it was even gone. Marie-Louise von Franz, a close colleague of Jung, put it very clearly when she said, "We see a content in the other person that actually belongs to us. We transfer it outward because the other person has just enough of a real hook to receive that projection. But the vast majority of what you are responding to is not coming from them at all. It is coming from you and the parts of your own soul that never got integrated into who you are today. The real problem is that you cannot actually integrate a missing piece of yourself by finding another person to hold it for you. You only integrate those parts by recognizing them as yours. But most people never get to that step because the drama of the relationship eats up all their attention before the pattern becomes clear. What happens instead is a very specific loop where the relationship intensifies until the exact quality that pulled you in starts to create massive friction. That spontaneity or expressiveness that felt like a relief at first starts to feel like a threat or a disruption because it is activating something unresolved and unnamed inside of you. Eventually, the relationship breaks down or becomes too painful to continue, and then a few months later, you meet someone new who carries that same quality, and the whole sequence starts all over again. It is a different person with the same emotional shape, and your disowned material is just sitting there, waiting for a new surface to land on. I want to make this concrete for you because the abstract version of this idea is easy to follow but very hard to actually use in your real life. This loop has a specific structure made of 5 links that always appear in the same order, and once you can see the chain clearly, you can finally find the spot where it is breakable. Link 1 is the original wound, which is something that happened early on in a primary relationship that created a specific emotional expectation for how the world works. This is not a conscious belief you could write down on a piece of paper, but rather a felt sense in your body of how closeness functions. You might feel that love always comes with strings attached, or that needing something makes you a burden, or that being strong means never letting anyone see what is happening underneath. Whatever that shape is, it became the emotional grammar your nervous system uses to read every single relationship that has come since. Link 2 is the split where the parts of you that did not fit that original template got disowned for your own protection. You learned through constant repetition what was safe to show and what had to stay hidden. So the version of you that worked stayed visible while everything else went into the basement. This is what the shadow looks like in your daily life, and it is not some dramatic dark side, but rather the heavy weight of everything you hid just to stay connected to the people you needed most. Link 3 is the recognition signal that fires when you meet someone new and your nervous system starts scanning them for a pattern match. When it finds someone whose emotional style or way of holding distance resembles that original template from Link 1, it sends a massive signal to your brain. That signal does not arrive with a warning label that says, "This person is a familiar wound," but instead, it feels like incredible chemistry or a spark that tells you, "This person is different." The signal is real, and your nervous system is not lying to you, but it is registering a resemblance rather than actual compatibility. And those two things are not the same. If you want help catching that recognition signal early, this video is sponsored by Senda, the AI journal that shows you the patterns and blind spots shaping your life. You can build an AI coach around the exact relationship pattern you want to understand, using pattern analysis across entries to see what keeps repeating. Try it free for 7 days through the link in the description. Now let's look at link 4. Link 4 is the loop itself, where the relationship unfolds and begins to mirror the structure of your original wound. The same old defenses get triggered, and you find yourself working much harder than the other person to hold things together, or you find yourself shrinking in those same familiar ways. Because the dynamic feels so familiar to your body, you stay much longer than the evidence says you should, and you keep trying to fix the situation using the same old strategies and the same desperate hope that this time things will shift. Link 5 is where most people finally exit the relationship, and it is the specific link that keeps the entire chain running for years. When the relationship ends without you mapping out the pattern, you leave with a story that is entirely about that other person and their flaws. You tell yourself, he was unavailable or she was too dependent, and while those things might be true, they are just observations about someone else rather than data about your own loop. The actual data, like the moments where you ignored your own intuition, or the specific shape of what you were drawn to, stays completely unexamined. Because that data is ignored, Link 1 stays perfectly intact, and your internal template never gets an update. When you meet someone new who has just enough of a hook to catch your projection, Link 3 fires again, and the whole chain assembles itself around a brand new person. This is not just a run of bad luck, but a structure that has been running your life. And the good news is that structures can be read and understood. There is a specific mechanism that makes this chain so incredibly hard to break, and I want to be clear that it has nothing to do with your willpower or how much you want to change. You aren't failing because you lack self-awareness or because you aren't trying hard enough to find a healthy partner. The reality is that your pattern recognition system operates on a completely different timeline than your conscious thinking mind. By the time you are even aware of an attraction, or by the time you start forming an opinion about whether this person is actually good for you, the recognition software has already finished its run. The signal has fired, your nervous system has already registered a match, and you are essentially arriving late to a decision that was made without your input. This isn't some kind of design flaw in your brain, because it is actually how the system is supposed to work. Pattern recognition evolved to be lightning fast, since speed was once the only way to survive a dangerous environment. The part of your brain that detects relational cues, threat, safety, and familiarity is much older and faster than the part that sits down to deliberate. It doesn't wait for your considered judgment or your pros and cons list. It just gives you the result and expects you to act on it immediately. What this means for you practically is that the strategies most people try simply do not work at the level where the problem is actually running. Telling yourself to choose differently next time doesn't work because the choice happens before the instruction even arrives in your head. Making a list of the qualities you want in a partner doesn't work either, because when that recognition signal fires, your nervous system isn't consulting a piece of paper. Even understanding your attachment style doesn't automatically change the outcome, because understanding is a high-level process while the pattern runs in the basement. You can know exactly what you tend to do and still find yourself doing it, watching yourself do it in real time, yet feeling totally unable to intervene before it is too late. The gap here isn't in your awareness, but rather it is the space between when the recognition fires and when you can bring any deliberate thought to bear on it. For most people, that gap is just too wide to cross. Not because they are unintelligent, but because the map was built before reflection was even possible and has been running without interruption ever since. What actually narrows that gap isn't more insight in the moment, but instead it is about building enough familiarity with your own map that the signal starts to feel like something you can identify rather than something you are simply pulled by. You aren't going to catch the signal before it fires, as that just isn't an option for a human brain. But you can learn to read the signal quickly enough, right after it hits, so that you can ask a different question before the loop gathers too much momentum to stop. The question isn't whether or not you feel the attraction, because you are going to feel it regardless of what you think. The real question is, what is this feeling responding to? What specific shape is it recognizing? And where exactly did I first learn that this shape was what love looked like? That isn't analysis paralysis. It is what I call pattern literacy, and it only comes from doing the work before you are in the situation, rather than trying to figure it out while you're in the middle of it. So how do you actually go about building that kind of familiarity with your own map? It doesn't happen by accumulating more abstract self-knowledge, because insight that doesn't connect to your specific sequence of actions will never update that sequence. You could read every book ever written on psychological projection and still run the exact same loop, because the loop doesn't live in your concepts, it lives in the chain of signals and responses your nervous system has rehearsed 1,000 times. What interrupts that cycle is making contact with the pattern at the level of specificity, rather than just talking in broad categories. It isn't enough to say that you tend toward anxious attachment, so you need to ask what specifically happens in your body during the first 2 weeks of a new relationship. You have to find where the urgency shows up, what you start doing, or what you suddenly stop doing that you wouldn't dream of doing in any other area of your life. Instead of saying you are drawn to unavailable people, look at what unavailability actually looks like in the people you have chosen in the past. Is it a physical distance, or is it more about inconsistent contact and a particular kind of ambiguity they use to keep you at arm's length? You have to look at your own response to that behavior, whether you pursue them harder or if you compress your own needs so you seem less demanding to them. Maybe you just wait in a kind of low-grade suspension, tracking every single text or signal for evidence of where you actually stand with them. Your response is the only data that matters here, because that is where the map shows its true shape. I want you to start with the most recent relationship that ended in that familiar kind of pain. But don't spend time analyzing what the other person did wrong. Map your own behavior inside that container, looking for where you overrode something you noticed early on, or where you stayed long past the point where the evidence told you everything you needed to know. Find the moments where you worked 10 times harder to maintain the connection than the other person was working, or where you made yourself easier to be around by making yourself smaller. Then I want you to take the relationship before that one and ask the exact same set of questions. If the same sequence appears again, then that sequence is the pattern. And it isn't a coincidence or a personality trait. It is your map reproducing itself through different people and different material. Then you have to go even further back to find where you first learned that specific sequence. Think about what relationship or what repeated dynamic taught you that this is how love operates, because that is link 1 in the chain where the template was originally built. You aren't going back there to assign blame or to build a sad narrative about your childhood. You are going back because the recognition signal at link 3 only loses its grip when you know precisely what it has been trained to recognize. Once you can see the original shape clearly, the signal starts arriving with a label on it instead of just a blind pull. The signal won't stop firing, but you will start reading it differently. And that is exactly where the exit finally opens up for you. You can find a way out of this loop, but it probably won't look like what you expect. Escaping this cycle isn't about finding the perfect person before you've done the work, and it definitely isn't about waiting until you're fully healed. That version of yourself doesn't exist, and honestly, never will, because everyone carries patterns with them. The real difference is whether those patterns are running your life, or if you've finally started running them. The exit you're looking for is actually a gap. It's a small space, sometimes only lasting a few seconds, that opens up between the moment a signal fires in your brain and the moment you decide to act on it. You don't even have to create this gap because it already exists, which means you just have to start using it differently than you have in the past. When that familiar pull arrives and someone triggers a deep sense of recognition that makes the loop start picking up speed, you shouldn't try to suppress the feeling or fight it with cold logic. The better move is to get curious about the sensation before it turns into unstoppable momentum. You have to ask yourself what your nervous system is actually responding to, or what specific emotional shape in this person matches something you already know from your past. You need to figure out if what you're feeling is a genuine connection or just the recognition of a wound you haven't finished mapping out yet. You don't need to have a perfect answer right away, and you don't have to trace every feeling back to its source during that very first conversation. The goal is simply to stay in contact with the question long enough to make a conscious choice instead of letting the current carry you away. These loops run on speed because the system needs you to move before you have a chance to think. The moment a question enters that sequence, the automation breaks, and you stop being a person who is just executing a program. You start reading the code instead. And that is where the actual shift happens, moving you from running a pattern to seeing it clearly enough to decide what happens next. There is one specific piece of this puzzle that usually gets left out, and it matters more than you think. The qualities that pull you towards someone most powerfully aren't always just echoes of old wounds, but are often the disowned parts of your own personality that you felt you had to split off long ago. When you meet someone who carries those qualities freely, that pull you feel isn't just simple attraction. It's a form of longing, or the specific ache of being near a version of something you decided early on that you weren't allowed to be. This is exactly where the loop finds its teeth and starts to bite. Eventually, the very quality that drew you in becomes the primary source of conflict in the relationship. That spontaneity you loved starts looking like irresponsibility, or their expressiveness starts feeling like it's just too much for you to handle. The other person hasn't actually changed, but your tolerance for the part of yourself they were carrying for you has finally run out. You can't resolve this cycle by just swapping out partners and hoping for a different result. You resolve it by asking yourself when you decided you weren't allowed to have that quality for yourself. You have to find where you learned that a specific need, or anger, or even just a sense of spaciousness was too dangerous for you to carry openly. When you can finally hold more of yourself, the projection loses its destination and the loop runs out of fuel. Your map doesn't decide your fate, but you have to learn how to read it before it stops running your life.